My name is Matt Withers. I'm a sociologist at the Australian National University. And today I'm going to be talking about some findings from an article I published earlier in the year, which looks at the relationship between social reproduction and uneven development in the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme. So to begin, it's important to set the context for this scheme as emerging from trends within Australia's temporary labour migration regime. And what I want to initially draw attention to is the pivotal moment in which the Migration Act in 1996 was reformed to introduce temporary labour migration pathways, really for the first time in Australia's migration regime. So it becomes a pivotal moment in the course of Australia's labour regimes. And what we've seen broadly occurring after that point in time is a secular decoupling of permanent migration intake, which you can see on screen here, represented by the purple line on the graph, which is a representation of annual permanent residency intake. And what we see in terms of the expansion of temporary foreign worker programs and international mobility programs represented on the blue line. So in the 20 years or so in the lead up to COVID-19, this goes from being about a ratio of sort of 3 times the temporary pathways to that of permanent, to almost 7 times the amount of temporary work relative to permanent entry points. And so there's a number of different moments in this timeline following the Migration Act reforms. The first is the introduction of a temporary skill visa, what was known as the subclass 457, which is now a temporary skill shortage visa, which really represents Australia's first temporary foreign worker program. We then see the deregulation of de facto temporary labour migration schemes, such as working holiday maker and student visa schemes, which broadly come under this definition of international mobility programs. And after that, there's the introduction of 2 separate Pacific labour mobility schemes, which have now been consolidated under the so-called PALM scheme, which represents not only a temporary foreign worker program, but also Australia's really first guest worker initiative. And it's interesting to note here that mobility is being used in a way that's quite different to how we've been talking about it in terms of mobility for working holiday makers and student visas. The discourse of mobility around this Pacific labour migration scheme is specifically to do with the presumed circularity of workers, the idea that there is no pathway to permanency at all. And so each of these programs have introduced spatial and temporal constraints, which result in exceptions to the National Labour Relations Framework. Many of them contain limitations on the length of stay that migrant workers have in Australia, the number of hours they can work per fortnight or per employer in the case of working holiday makers and students. But also it has introduced for the first time employer sponsorship to varying degrees. So the temporary skill shortage visa is an employer sponsored visa, but it does have potential for workers to change employers, whereas the PALM visa doesn't. Most of these programs also have geographic incentives and restrictions attached to them to try and direct labour to particular parts of Australia's labour market, particularly in rural and regional areas. And they all contain elements of welfare chauvinism in which migrant workers can't access the same social protections as permanent residents, despite making taxable contributions to those welfare systems. All of this culminates in what my colleagues Stephen Clibborn and Chris Wright have referred to as Australia becoming a guest worker state, which is quite important because Australia has attested never to be a guest worker country. And so we've seen a real paradigm shift occurring over the last couple of decades. The PALM scheme in particular is really the paradigmatic example of this trend towards guest work. It encompasses 2 smaller schemes, the 2012 seasonal worker program, which is what most people are familiar with, but also a later introduced program, the Pacific Labour Scheme, which is a longer term program open to more industries. Both schemes are open to individual workers coming from 10 particular countries, from Fiji, Kiribati, Nauru, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, the Solomon Islands, Timor-Leste, Tonga, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu. But they entail individual employer-tied visas for periods of up to 9 months under the seasonal worker program, but actually for as long as 4 years under the Pacific Labour Scheme. And these jobs are limited to so-called unskilled, low-skilled, and semi-skilled work. We've already heard about these constructions of skill being reflective of racialized overtones, but these positions are tied to these skill classifications, but only in rural and regional postcodes as well. So there's geographic restrictions placed on them. And workers who are employed through these schemes have no real say in where they are deployed, to use the language of the scheme, and nor do they have any rights to family accompaniment. And this also applies to those workers who are here for 4-year contracts. So effectively that entails 4 years of separation from romantic partners and dependent children. Deductions are taken from workers' pay to fund all of the recruitment and travel costs associated with the scheme. And yet employers are the ones who are assigned responsibility for overall welfare of the workers, even in remote locations. So you can get a sense of the kind of power imbalances which are ingrained through the program. So my contention here is that Palm Long in particular, the longer term scheme, is really Australia's first multi-year guest worker program. It has very similar policy parameters to what we see in West Asia, in the kafala system that pervades the Persian Gulf, but also in East Asia, in Taiwan and Hong Kong, or in Southeast Asia and Singapore and Malaysia. These are really the sort of facsimile models to what we see in Australia's PALM program. Of course, it's framed as a triple win migration development scheme by the Australian government, but I'm much more sympathetic to Scott McWilliam's determination that really what this is doing is framing the South Pacific as a permanent labour reserve for low-wage production and reproduction in rural Australia, and really trying to tether the region to the needs of Australia's rural economy. As of earlier this year, there are approximately 34,000 workers enrolled within the PALM scheme. Around about 80% of those workers were men, but significantly more than half are now clustered in this PALM Long program rather than the seasonal worker program. So there's been a real shift towards the long-term scheme. And amongst those long-term workers, as many as 70% are employed in meat processing. So it's overwhelmingly moved out of horticulture and towards meat processing as the key industry. Aged care is also a growing industry for the scheme as well. So it's probably not surprising in a way that the PALM scheme involves greater labour control processes than any of the other work visas, given Australia's history of racially segmenting labour markets, which extends back to colonial practices. My colleagues Kirsty Petru and John Connell have drawn attention to the similarities between contemporary guest worker programs and the colonial so-called blackbirding of Pacifica labour, which occurred in the 19th century. And this has been brought up as well with workers who I've spoken to, as well as Pacifica diaspora groups in Australia. They're all keenly aware of the parallels between the contemporary program and the colonial practices that foreshadowed or preceded it. So between 1863 and 1908, so-called Kanaka workers laboured under conditions ranging from indenture to slavery on Australian sugarcane plantations, as well as elsewhere in the region. And this is what's being evoked through the PALM scheme, largely because the workers who are employed in the PALM scheme remain unfree. They're limited to racialized and gendered labor practices in devalued industries like aged care and meat processing, but they're also tied to sponsored employers in very remote locations, so that they're kept in situations where there's a lack of social infrastructure, there's a lack of connection to major cities, and there's a high rate of dependency upon employers. The only alternative to this is the so-called absconding, again to use the language used by the Australian government, into irregular status to move away from these employers. There's no mechanism for changing employers within the scheme. So Scott McWilliam, a colleague of mine, notes that it is not a lack of formal evaluations or academic analysis of labour mobility programs and guest workers' existence that is missing. It is the refusal to place capitalism and capitals, the process of accumulation, at the centre of blackbirding, and also the recent revival termed labour mobility, which is the constant. And so here the idea that capital's mobility, the chase across the globe, would be a better starting point for understanding what is occurring across this scheme, and also what preceded it is the way of trying to think about how this plays out in the settler colonial context. I'm very much sympathetic with this view, and I think that McWilliam is right to address this dearth of attention to capital accumulation, largely because existing evaluation of the PALM scheme has really been mired in the technocratic project of migration and development. It's very much remittance-centric and focused on workers' remittances back to their home countries. But also, as Baglioni and others make clear, much has already been done to theorize the contemporary dynamics of global capital, And perhaps it's actually the labor regime itself which is more neglected. And so this is what I'm trying to get at with my paper, is more of a labor regime approach to thinking about the labor process and how this has implications both in Australia, but also in the Pacific. And so my contention here is that the PALM scheme is transnationally reconfiguring what Miriam Glucksmann has referred to as the total social organization of labor, with implications for labor control regimes in Australia, but also processes of social reproduction across the Pacific. So what I'm trying to do in order to articulate this is to think about a concept of transnational social reproduction. So as most people are probably familiar with, social reproduction could be thought of as the work that goes on to sustain and reproduce the worker themselves, and is generally understood to encompass three broad spheres of reproduction: that relating to biological life, like sex and childbirth, but also land management and the preservation of ecological systems; care practices, like the paid and unpaid labor that sustains future, past, and present generations; and social relations, which are effectively the cultural and institutional frameworks that enable production. But the transnationalization of these socially reproductive processes has profound implications. And so this is what I try and tease out in the paper: the idea that guesswork introduces important spatial and temporal variations to these processes, as place-bound migrant workers become dislocated from household and communal sites of social reproduction and must navigate the often asynchronous relational timescales of transnational family life. And in this sense, transnational social reproduction entails disruptions to the daily and intergenerational reproduction of life and labor power for migrant workers, their households, and for their communities. And to think about the consequences of this, I've been drawing on Shireen Rai's framework of depletion as a way of imputing the human cost of lost or displaced socially reproductive resources, and to try and extend this framework through guest worker migration to think about what the uneven developmental outcomes of these schemes are. To do so, I've been conducting interviews with workers for the past 5 or so years. This has entailed interviews with representatives of government who are from Pacific Island countries like Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, and Vanuatu, who can speak to the entirety of the program. I've also conducted upwards of 70 interviews with workers from Tonga, Vanuatu, and Timor-Leste, as well as their family members at the start of this program, and another 20 interviews that have been conducted with the Kiribati workers at the end of the pilot scheme, which came before it. So I've got various vantage points into the scheme and the various experiences that people have had at different points in its duration. And what I'm left with is thinking about, first of all, the implications of social reproduction through the labor process for workers in Australia. And so here, production and reproduction become blurred as Australia's restrictive migration policies enable what Jonas refers to as local labor control regimes, through which employers have a lot of control not only over workers' lives at work, but also beyond the work site and over their conditions of reproduction. And so we can draw here on labor process theory, and specifically the literature around dormitory labor, to think about how the collapsing of production and reproduction affects workers' outcomes, and in the sense of depletion, manifests in harm when workers are unable to meet the conditions of their daily reproduction. I have a quote here from one worker who told me that overwork leads to sickness as well. Like if one of us in the house gets sick, I've got to go to work, but then I have to look after the other person. I have to look after myself. It's very hard. They said you can stay home if you're really sick, and like that's at the beginning. But when we get into the job, they couldn't accept any sick leave. They couldn't accept any conversation about getting sick. Like they want you to be at work, and this speaks to the employer's undue influence over the conditions with which workers return to the work site. In Pacific Island countries, instead, what I'm seeing is amongst migrant households, a reorganization of unpaid care activities, but with limited so-called care circulation in terms of the transnational extension of care practices. Instead, there's been a lot of so-called care deficits and relationship breakdowns affecting family life. One worker told me that more and more you see young people neglecting their parents when they get old. They live their own lives, they don't look after their parents, and you find old people struggling for themselves. Because in the islands, it's hard to get water, food from the garden, and you find old people trying very hard daily, struggling to survive. In terms of implications for local communities, there was seen to be a loss of communal labor that's vital to environmental and cultural reproduction, as well as to broader social relations. And I won't read the quote for lack of time. But the final point I want to impress is that there's also implications taking place at a broader scale of economy and society in the Pacific, where public and private investments in the renewal of labour power basically subsidize rural Australia. And so what this has done is to reshape human capital formation, to use an undesirable term, in the image of foreign labour markets. And this entails de-skilling and brain drain for Pacific Island labour markets and countries. A member of government from Tonga told me that the demand is coming from one major industry, and we don't have a meatworks industry here. We're seeing an increased number of trades workers, chefs, skilled, semi-skilled workers going on low-skilled horticulture and meatworks jobs because that's the only thing that's available, and that becomes a skill strain effectively. So my conclusions then are that this framework of depletion is not only a way of analyzing inflows and outflows of socially reproductive resources, which is how Shireen Rai and her co-authors initially use it. It's not just a matter of mapping out these resources amongst individuals, households, and communities. It can also be extended transnationally as a means of mapping the uneven development outcomes of precarious migration, such as palm, occurring between countries, but also beyond the boundary of production, to follow Marilyn Waring's insistence that we think of the economy as more than what's captured in GDP. So my research, what I've conducted through this paper, attempts to expose ideal types of depletion that arise from this transnational social reproduction in the South Pacific. That is, it's not applicable in every instance, but it's an indicative schema of lost capacity and the potential for harm to arise from these outcomes. The two key points to it are spatiality, which reveals how guest worker migration intersects with multiple social relations of production and reproduction, including those adjacent to capitalism, from the subsistence economies which are prevalent throughout the South Pacific, but also to the semi-feudal conditions of production which are occurring in rural Australia through this guest worker program. And lastly, the other point to this is that time and temporality matters too, and the relative timescales of outcomes from these programs. The income gains that the scheme generates and what typically celebrates the PALM scheme might be impactful in the short term, but the erosion of socially reproductive capacity will become more apparent in the mid to long term, is what my findings indicate, and that these might ultimately be more consequential outcomes in the long run. Thank you.